Europe in the early 14th century believed it was entering a golden age. Populations were rising, farms expanded into forests and wetlands, markets were busy, cities were growing larger every year. To most people, the future looked stable. Then the rain came. Not a storm, not a flood, but something far worse. Week after week, clouds refused to clear. Fields turned into mud. Seeds began to rot underground. Animals starved because hay could not dry. And slowly, quietly, the food supply of an entire continent began to collapse. Within 3 years, millions of people would die. Villages would disappear. Parents would abandon children they could no longer feed. And in some places, hunger would push human beings beyond the limits of morality itself. This disaster became known as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. But the famine was not just about hunger. It revealed something terrifying about medieval society. Civilization was far more fragile than anyone imagined, and all it took to expose that fragility was rain. Before the famine, Europe was experiencing dramatic population growth. Between the years 1000 and 1300, the population of Europe nearly doubled. Forests were cleared for farms, marshlands were drained, new villages appeared across the countryside. For generations, this expansion seemed like progress, but it created a dangerous problem. Most land that could easily produce food was already being used. Farmers began cultivating poorer soils, rocky hillsides, wetlands, and thin northern fields. These lands could produce crops, but only during good weather. And medieval agriculture had very little margin for error. There were no large grain reserves, no refrigerated storage, no international shipping networks bringing emergency supplies from distant continents. Almost every village depended entirely on the harvest from the previous year. If one harvest failed, people could tighten their belts. If 2 harvests failed, society began to strain. 3 failures in a row could break the entire system. And in 1315, that is exactly what happened. The year 1315 began with relentless rain. Spring planting became nearly impossible. Fields were so saturated that seeds drowned in the soil. Farmers waited for dry weather, but the skies remained gray. Week after week, rain continued. Wheat and barley fields failed to grow properly. Hay could not be harvested. Without dry hay, livestock faced starvation during the coming winter. This meant that even if crops recovered next year, farm animals might not survive long enough to help plant them. Then summer arrived. Normally, summer meant sunlight and growth. Instead, storms continued. Crops that managed to grow began to rot. Fungal diseases spread rapidly in the damp climate. When autumn arrived, the harvest was catastrophic. Across large parts of Europe, yields were less than half of normal. In some regions, farmers harvested almost nothing at all. At first, people assumed the next year would be better, but the rain returned again in 1316, and this time Europe was already running out of food. The first impact of famine appeared in markets. Grain prices began rising rapidly. A loaf of bread that once cost a single coin now cost several.
For wealthy households, this was inconvenient. For poor families, it was devastating. Most peasants already spent the majority of their income on food. When prices doubled or tripled, survival became impossible. Families began selling possessions, tools, clothing, livestock, land. But as the crisis spread, buyers disappeared. Everyone needed food. No one had money. Meanwhile, many farmers made a desperate choice. They ate the grain that was supposed to be planted the following spring. This provided temporary relief, but it guaranteed that the next harvest would be even worse.
By late 1315, hunger was visible everywhere. Children stopped growing. The elderly weakened quickly. Disease spread easily among malnourished populations. Crime increased. At first, it was small thefts, a missing loaf of bread, a stolen sack of grain. But punishments in medieval Europe were severe. People who stole food often faced execution, yet many still took the risk, because starvation was worse. Families faced unimaginable choices. Some parents abandoned children they could not feed. Others left their homes entirely, hoping to find food somewhere else. Roads filled with desperate travelers. Many collapsed before reaching their destination. Chroniclers of the time described bodies lying beside roads and fields, not gathered in large numbers, just scattered, one by one. As famine deepened, darker stories began circulating. Travelers reported people eating animals that were normally considered inedible. Dogs, cats, even leather boiled into soup. In some desperate communities, chroniclers hinted at something even more disturbing: cannibalism. These reports were rare and often written cautiously, but the fact that church authorities began condemning such acts in sermons suggests they did occur. Starvation changes the human mind. When survival becomes uncertain, moral boundaries can collapse. This was not widespread across Europe, but the fact that it happened at all reveals the depth of the crisis. The famine created a devastating cycle. Farm animals died due to lack of feed. Without animals, farmers could not plow fields efficiently. Without plowing, crop production fell even further. Meanwhile, seeds had already been consumed for food. Even if the weather improved, many farmers had nothing left to plant. Entire agricultural systems began failing. This meant recovery would take years, not months. By 1317, weather conditions began improving. Harvests slowly returned, but the damage had already been done. Millions had died. Entire villages disappeared from historical records. Farmland was abandoned. Communities that once thrived were reduced to a handful of survivors. Even those who lived through the famine carried permanent scars. Children who suffered malnutrition often grew into weaker adults. Their immune systems were damaged. Many would die early from disease. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 ended slowly. But Europe did not have long to recover. Within a generation, a far worse catastrophe would arrive: the Black Death. The plague did not cause the famine, but it weakened Europe dramatically. Malnutrition damaged immune systems. Social systems were already fragile. When plague arrived in the mid-14th century, the continent was already wounded. The Great Famine reminds us of something uncomfortable about history. Civilizations often appear stable, but stability can be an illusion.
In medieval Europe, society depended on fragile systems. One bad harvest created hardship. 3 bad harvests nearly destroyed a continent. The famine did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly. Rain, rotting crops, empty barns, and slowly the collapse of an entire world. The people who survived never forgot those years because they learned a lesson that still echoes through history. Civilization is fragile, and sometimes all it takes to break it is rain.